Good morning, everyone. Just a quick update on the madness unfolding between the US and the rest of the world, and obviously particularly as it relates to South Africa. Before we get to the really important stuff, let's start with what a new senator in Texas by the name of Senator Jackson has just proposed a bill, and the bill is to require a full review of the bilateral relationship between the US and South Africa and identify South African government officials and ANC leaders eligible for the imposition of sanctions and for other purposes. That's quite an alarming start to a Friday morning. So let's understand what it is that the senator wants to accomplish. And from there, what would the potential implications be on South Africa? And what are the chances of this unfolding? So the first issue is a questioning of whether or not South Africa is actually non-aligned. Now, on this, it's fairly obvious that we like to say we're non-aligned, but there's pitiful evidence that is actually the case. They get into more detail on why that is so. But we know South Africa should be non-aligned. That is the sensible position to take as a small economy. But if you look at our behavior towards Ukraine, for example, definitely not. If you look at our smuggling Omar al-Bashir out the country in 2015, someone who genuinely has committed genocide, then when one looks at the charges at the ICJ, the hypocrisy becomes evident. Now, should South Africa have taken Israel to the ICJ? That is open to debate, but we should not confuse this with non-alignment. Now, they then go into who are some of the more noxious actors that we've sided with. One is Hamas. Very hard, no matter what your position on Palestine might be, very hard to find any sympathy at all for Hamas, who not only sparked off the insanity unfolding in the Middle East at the moment on October the 7th, when they entered Israel and essentially committed a pogrom, just killed a whole lot of Jews, almost all of whom were civilians, many children, and then bragged about it on social media. So not nice people. On the other side, we're quite keen on hanging out with Iran. Again, it's good to hear our Department of International Relations saying that we're not getting closer to Iran, but there is some evidence that is not true. Under Trump, we need to watch that relationship more closely. So that's the second one. They say, look, we're getting quite close to China. That may be true. The US is not helping by their actions. So South Africa probably pulls even closer to China. China is an enormous trading partner of South Africa. Maybe we only send rocks on ships to them and then we import manufactured goods, but they are an enormous part of our export basket. You cannot simply ignore China and Russia. Now, it's not obvious that that's a liability anymore. I think what Russia started in Ukraine is simply unforgivable. However, Trump appears to be in a forgiving spirit towards Putin. And so perhaps our close relationship with Russia gets a bit of a free pass. And then kind of scrolling down a little bit, again, I'm just highlighting things. They then say the ANC hosted 3 members of Hamas in Pretoria. That is true. Not a good look again. Certainly not helping here. Certainly not helping our position on non-alignment. My views on Hamas, lest anyone be confused, is I think they're reprehensible. I have a slightly different take on Palestine, and I think the killing of many civilians there is different, but hard for me to find an empathetic neuron in my head at all towards Hamas. And they go on to say, on October the 7th, 2024, the ANC commemorated only the Palestinian lives lost to Israel while accusing Israel of genocide. Again, when we're talking non-alignment, that's not a great look. So the non-alignment issue is going to feature more frequently. There are countries which have played the non-alignment card far better than us. India comes to mind as probably the best example. And I think there's something to be learned from India. So I'm not suggesting South Africa shift its policies and simply bow the knee to Trump. What I am saying is there are consequences to the positions that we have taken. And then, of course, it was always going to come up, the appointment of Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool to the US for a hot minute. Now, I don't particularly have a view one way or the other on Ambassador Rasool or ex-Ambassador Rasool now. What is important is the selection of our next ambassador, which really needs to happen with a far greater sense of urgency. And what I can say is I certainly am not coming up with anyone that I think should be the next ambassador, but the next ambassador should have strong diplomatic skills. I think we need to break the habit of sending politicians, many of them who've done something inappropriate, and then packing them off to ambassadorial posts, particularly for important countries like the US. So the selection of our next ambassador is extremely important. And I think it's a lot more important, in fact, to select that person properly than it is to send endless streams of people over to try to find some way to resolve the issues with the US. They go on. The renaming of Santon Drive to Leila Khalid Drive. And they then quote Deputy Secretary General Nomvula Mokonyane saying, we want the United States of America Embassy to change their letterhead to #1 Leila Khalid Drive. Now, that is a problem, and that's a relatively easy problem to solve. Do not do the name change. This is such a ridiculous action to take. Whatever your views on the US might be, the US have done some horrible things in the past. There's reason to be mad at them over some things. This truly has got to be one of those things that just makes no sense at all. It just causes harm with no upside, and we certainly can't afford to be in that position. By the way, this is the same person who said she will pick up the rand when it falls. Now would be a good time for that to happen, I might point out. Back to Lady R, I think they exaggerate the position here somewhat, and they say arms were being smuggled into or out of South Africa. That was never found. Of course, it didn't help that all of the findings were secret. But be that as it may, I think it's an unfair shot at South Africa. But then they point out Operation Mosey 2. Now, for those of you who forget, this was a joint naval operation between China and Russia between February 17th and the 27th of Feb 2023, corresponding with the 1-year anniversary of Russia's unjustified and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. This just doesn't make any sense. Why we did that, I honestly have no idea. I'd written about it at the time and very critical of it. But be that as it may, we did it. We must stop doing things like that. Again, you cannot call yourself neutral when you do not behave in a way that is neutral. Authorizing a US-sanctioned Russian military cargo airplane to land at a South African Air Force base. Not aware of that before now. If that happened, again, not clever. And then they mentioned the sanctioned oligarch, Victor Vekselberg, donating $826,000 to the ANC. That's really an internal ANC issue, but you will see when they get to the proposed actions, they get very targeted on individuals. Now, to be clear, I think sanctioning is a terrible idea. It would harm South Africa. Whether those sanctions are against the country or against individuals, this is a very bad idea. But it's a possibility now. Let's continue. The ANC publishing an article in their newspaper in October 24, promoting Russian propaganda about the war in Ukraine. This truly is the pot calling the kettle black, given that Trump has done literally the same thing. Word for word has been propagating the message of Putin. So we've got to go easy on the criticism here when the US president has done the same thing. Comments again more about China, particularly the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang region of China. Again, this is not a secret. There's some horrible things going on there, as President Trump likes to say about South Africa. But I'm not sure what they expect South Africa to do about this. But be that as it may, that gets raised as well. And then the allowing the private test flying academy of South Africa, which the Department of Commerce added to the entity list on June the 12th, 2023, to recruit former US and NATO fighter pilots to train Chinese People Liberation Army pilots. And there's been a sanctioning now of a number of aerospace companies. This sort of thing is dangerous. I would not want to suggest that anyone in government was deliberately involved in this, because I think there's certainly no evidence I'm aware of that. But be that as it may, South Africa is going to have to be on its toes monitoring things like these restricted lists that the US puts out. If we do not, I think the consequences stand to be more severe than they've probably ever been in the past. Another shotgun to the foot here was South Africa demanding Taiwan relocate its representative office out of Pretoria and downgrade its status to that of a trade office. This is utterly nonsensical. And again, one of those things that costs nothing to not do, but the consequences of doing are extremely severe. And I think for those things that cost nothing to just do the right thing, we simply need to do the right thing. And that's really important. Moving on. They go on about Eskom. They go on about Transnet. I'm not sure why this is appearing here. So what if South Africa has gotten these things wrong in the past? Somewhat amusingly, I guess not for the people who caught the cholera, but that gets an honorable mention, and it is a shameful event in South Africa's history that people died of cholera. Completely unacceptable in a developed economy. They go on about rampant state capture, which again, the irony should not be lost on anyone here, given that Trump has just proposed or has already lifted the laws barring American companies from providing an extra incentive in a brown paper envelope when they deal with other countries. Adding to this the corruption that can easily be seen inside the own American system. But of course, America gets to do it. They get to criticize the rest of us. To be clear, we need to deal with our corruption, no question. I'm just not sure that the way for South Africa to deal with its corruption is for that to be externally imposed. And essentially from there, they say, look, all of these things, when you put them together, threatens America's national security, and South Africa needs to do something about it. And then let's get through what they propose to do. I think if these sanctions are imposed, it'll be a terrible day for South Africa. But they then say to the president, we need you to do the following. Not later than 120 days after the date of the enactment of this act, the president, in consultation with the Secretary of State and Secretary of Treasury, shall submit to the appropriate congressional committees a classified report that includes, 1, a list of senior South African government and ANC leaders the president determines have engaged in corruption or human rights abuses that would be sufficient based on credible evidence to meet the criteria for the imposition of sanctions. And they then reference the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act. Um, I don't know what happens with that. That's fairly harsh, but there we go. That is what is being proposed. You could read the detail in the document itself, but the expected timeline for sanctions to be imposed with respect to such a person um, needs to be given by the president. But importantly, they then say, look, if the president doesn't want to do this, they want him to give detailed justification describing the rationale and legal authorities underlying such a negative determination. Now, the problem is this is not Biden and it's not Obama. For reasons I don't entirely understand, the US has an issue with South Africa. My guess on this is something that Trump would find very appealing. So a little bit scary. And I think we need to stop poking the bear. And then onto even more important news. We've done some analysis of the reciprocal tariffs that have been imposed. A terrible thing, 31% against South Africa on most things, except for the minerals like platinum that we send to the US. Those are exempted, and that's a big exemption. That's 50% of what we export. And then our steel, aluminium, and autos will attract at 25%, and everything else at 30%. And so things like agriculture, particularly, are going to take an extreme amount of pain. But then interesting to identify where the real threats to the US come from globally by looking at some of the other areas that have received reciprocal tariffs as well. The Hood and McDonald Islands, these remote uninhabited islands near Antarctica, home only to penguins and seals. So these are not Navy SEALs. These are seals, seals, the ones that swim around and get eaten by whales. They were hit with a 10% tariff. They, in fact, don't do trade with the US or, in fact, anyone else in the world because no one lives there. Jan Mayen in Norway, a volcanic island in the Arctic Ocean with no permanent population, was also subjected to a 10% tariff. Now you can see the theme here of the threat of injury of these empty islands. What can happen in future? One will have to see. The British Indian Ocean Territory, yet another hotbed of anti-American sentiment. This territory primarily hosting military personnel, notice that, around 3,000 facing a tariff. Now you can see those 3,000 people, existential risk to the US. We've got a couple of other hostile territories. Tokelau, New Zealand, population of 1,500, got a 10% tariff, almost no trade with the US. Norfolk Island, Australia, you can see the Aussies coming in for a drubbing here. Small island, 2,000 residents, 29% tariff. Got to watch them. Who knows what those 2,000 are up to? Christmas Island, Australia. Now, this is particularly offensive to me. Christmas Island, of course, is the real home of Father Christmas, not the North Pole. The North Pole, that is just anti-American nonsense. Christmas Island is where they live. This island, Father Christmas plus 2,000 elves, 10% tariff. And in fact, they run a small surplus with the US. They buy mining equipment there. Lesotho, we all know what a problem Lesotho is, what an enormous threat to the US, threat even to South Africa and the rest of the African continent, 50%. Now, what's interesting is, of course, Trump only realized the threat from Lesotho recently. In fact, he didn't know Lesotho was a real country. But he's come out swinging. That sort of ignorance has been severely punished at the moment, and so he hits Lesotho with a 50% tariff. Svalbard, Norway, that's an Arctic archipelago, 2,500 residents, also facing a 10% tariff. So one can see Deep thought has gone into this. We await to see what happens. Just a reminder for everyone, we're having a webinar on the US on Wednesday, the 9th of April at 9 a.m. If you do not receive an invitation to that, you can contact us directly at info@xagta.com, and we'll make sure that you get to sit in and hear more, this time with more sensible people talking about all of this in some detail. Thank you and have a good weekend.